Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ESI Digital Summer. Day 5, North America, the last day of the conference. We're certainly going out with a bang. This is the Esports Betting in the USA panel. Lots of developments this year, and in truly the industry at large and in the US specifically. My name is Cody Luongo. I'm a journalist for Esports Insider and author of the ESI Gambling Report. So lots to talk about on this topic today. Thankfully, I don't have to do it by myself because I have a group of wonderful panelists with me today. So to quickly go ahead and make some introductions, on my upper left-hand side, we have Moritz, Maurer, who's the CEO of data platform Grid. Moritz, how are you doing today? Okay, having a little trouble hearing Moritz. Your production will hop on that real quick and help me. Moving down on the lower left, we have Stephen Salz, who's the CEO of Rivalry. Stephen, how are you?
Good, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Hey, no problem. I can hear you perfectly fine, so that's great then.
My bad.
Oh, there we go. Okay. How are you, Moritz? Good.
I'm
right,
good.
we have,
Glad to be here. Please go ahead.
On the upper right, we have Blaine Graboyes, who's the CEO and co-founder of the Las Vegas-based gambling company GameCo. Blaine, it's great to have you.
Great to be here, Cody, and especially great to be here with everyone else as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. And then last but not least, you have Lovell Walker, who's a former MGM sports executive, the head of esports specifically over there, and now the founder of his own company, Onward Media Lab. Lovell, how are you doing today?
Hey, doing well. Thanks for having me, Cody. Looking forward to this discussion.
Hey, fantastic. So before we get into anything, Moritz had a little slideshow, which we think will be a nice educational piece to this discussion, which really will outline the differences in data delivery between esports and traditional sports, which should help set the stage for this conversation a little bit. So without further ado, Moritz, if you want to go ahead and take it away.
Thanks. Yeah. So we thought it would be great for the context of everyone to speak a bit about the differences in esports and traditional sports data gathering. So in traditional sports, you look at manual match state entry as being the predominant way to gather data. This means human error is an absolute possibility. Events have to be events as the game is unfolding have to be verified. This happens after the fact through replays or even after the match. Often multiple feeds are necessary to have a sustainable data resolution to offer markets to your customers. And all of this is a lot of complexity despite a lot of technological advances in that area. While in esports, given that it's digital from the get-go, we're looking at a perfect data resolution as a starting point. So all the data that is processed is done in real time. It's 100% accurate, and the granularity is just mind-blowing. So this opens a lot of possibilities. The key thing is we don't have to sacrifice speed for granularity. There's no trade-off here. From a data resolution perspective, esports is offering a completely new opportunity for bookmakers to engage with and to offer an amazing service to their customers. What we're looking at here next is just a quick clip to outline just how complicated basketball data gathering can be. The person who has to collect the data points is sitting at the court side. They have a limited field of view. Some players might be obscured, or all the information they can dissect is not available right away. There's a lot of rebounds happening here. You have to attribute who took the shot or who got the rebound very often after the fact. So it's a clear example of just how hard it is to log events in real time as the action is unfolding. You can try this for yourself at home if you want to, just to talk over the action as it's happening. So ultimately here, it's just harder to do, and because it's being done manual, there's room for error. On esports, on the other hand, we don't have the need for a human to be involved in collecting data. All the data is available on a server. This is where we integrate directly with our technology. You have the perfect data resolution. For a human, there would be too much data to gather anyways, because through the means of how we extract data in esports, we're not depending on a specific camera angle. We know everything that happens anywhere on the map. And the amount of data that is collected is also, like, the sheer volume of data points going through a system is just astonishing. For a map of Counter-Strike, our software is logging more than 15,000 events just for one map of, for one game of Counter-Strike, for example. So at the end, what you're looking at as a result, end-to-end integration, completely automated. This allows algorithmic solutions to take advantage of this increased data resolution. It results in more betting opportunities, a very high market uptime, and very high resulting speed, which is great for the customer experience in the end. At the end of this round we're looking at here, you can see the CT player has one more enemy to eliminate. And let's see what's going on. You can actually follow the action of what's happening in a game without seeing the broadcast through these types of solutions. It makes it more accessible, and it makes it easier to tell stories too. So now in this example, after he takes out his last and potentially has enough time to defuse the bomb, the player is clutching out the round. We don't have a trade-off between
So as the problem with online events, you have people lagging out, and that is the case for Moritz. But we're going to work to get him back in here immediately, and obviously continue the conversation of data, which would be a piece of this conversation that's certainly important. So, okay, before I get any further as well, people that are there in the audience that have questions, you can put them into the chats, and we'll get to them at the end of the discussion. So feel free to do that. We'll circle back on that. But anyway, gentlemen, we have so much time and so much to talk about, so let's go ahead and just jump into it. For the purpose of this conversation, I thought it would be good to sort of talk a little bit about the sports landscape at large, and then sort of narrow down to the US. But Blaine, as we talked before, I thought it would be good to sort of outline, set the stage for the conversation by talking a little bit about, which states is esports betting currently regulated and legal in, because I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear the actuality of that situation. So if you wouldn't mind explaining for us a little bit about that.
Yeah, gladly, Cody. And I would say this is one of the first misconceptions or misunderstandings that we run into, even when we're talking to sports betting operators or casino operators. And for those that have access to it, Eilers and Kryjik do a really great esports betting report that outlines the jurisdictions and some of the market considerations about that. But today, going alphabetically, esports betting is legal in Colorado, Michigan with tribal, Nevada, New Jersey, Oregon, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and Washington. In addition to that, there are a handful of states that have esports betting or rather traditional sports betting legislation already approved that include esports, and that is Connecticut, Georgia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. So there are actually a lot of jurisdictions today in which this is able to be operated on a regulated basis.
Thank you for outlining that. Yeah, Eilers put out a great report recently that does outline that a little bit more finer, but agree, there is this sort of large misconception with people asking, well, why isn't it legal yet? And it's not that it is not legal per se, it's just sort of that the regulatory framework in the US makes it a bit cumbersome to actually, set it up to be like a full-fledged running machine. I see we've got Moritz back. How are you, pal? Good to have you back in here.
Sorry guys, the internet dropped. I don't know which part of the video you lost me, but I hope we got that part through. So, sorry guys, suffering from the heat here a bit, and I think the router is feeling it too. Let's let's stay positive that the rest of the panel will work out. Sorry for that, guys.
Hey, no problem at all. We heard a good bit, and we'll definitely circle back on the data point because that's going to be an important part of this conversation. So one question that I wanted to ask everyone, because in my conversation with stakeholders, a lot of them are telling me how you have to enter esports betting, the market, as an operator or in whichever part, in a very careful way, right? You have to be authentic to this audience. You have to market your products in a very specific way. So I would like to open the panel up to the floor, with the question of what do operators need to know and do to successfully enter this market with esports. And I think that we can sort of start on my left side with Moritz, Steven, and then go to Blaine and Lovell. So Moritz, if you wouldn't mind kicking this off.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about the challenges you have in the market for esports, especially speaking about the US, sports legislation is taking place and is on a good pace generally. But then we also have to think about, like, where does esports fall within that? Is it recognized as a sport? We've seen many states before that put it more in the event-based category. I think generally the key to all of that is education. I think. And I think educating stakeholders, educating regulators who might not spend the majority of the day on Twitch. This is exactly what has to take place, and then this being achieved ultimately. Then as a brand, I leave that more to the actual B2C brands being present here. But this is one of the things just that is always with us and with the conversations we have with our partners. Education is at the forefront of everything, getting people comfortable with it and showing them the great potential that is there for this industry.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Steven?
So I guess from our side, I mean, we're an operator, so it's going to definitely come from a B2C side. But I think from our experience, it's really just not a function of having depth in the esports offering itself. You as you would think about building out a traditional sports offering, but it's actually the other elements of the product that are in many ways as or more critical for this demographic in our experience. So 80 to 90% of our turnover is esports at the moment. Our average customer is well under 30. Many are first-time bettors, and they're of course esports fans. So the past couple of years operating, what we've seen is like the levers that really count in the product are not just the offering itself. It's really everything from onboard flow, KYC, customer support. It kind of all needs to be designed to be empathetic to that generation. So I think it's a nuance that may surprise some operators. You got to get the great esports offering, have the right data providers, odds providers. But I mean, little things like reducing friction on validating IDs even we found is like really distinctly different with this generation. So it goes throughout the entire product.
Yeah, absolutely. Blaine?
Well, at GameCo, we're in a unique position. We're totally focused on the US market. We do offer B2B services. Primarily, we're the partner of Grid for North America and are starting to see some real demand for the data products that Grid offers. But we're also doing some very unique B2C market access that we'll be announcing over the next few weeks, where we will ultimately be the front-end operator. And I agree with Steven on that. I think that on the product side, it's really important to be thoughtful of who the consumer is. I think on the business side of it, you have to be really thoughtful and strategic on how you enter the market. If you think about New Jersey as a market, typically skins there are very difficult to come by. If they are available, they're very expensive, typically $2 million upfront and $1 million a year. And I think it's fair to say that the revenue isn't there yet in an esports only offering. So I think it's up to us as an industry on the esports betting side of the business to find new innovative ways to enter the market. And a lot of that comes back to exactly what Moritz was speaking about, which is working with stakeholders on the education side of it. And, ultimately at the end of the day, it's great to have Lovell on board. He's probably done more event submissions which are required in Nevada and New Jersey, and is kind of a almost behind the scenes unknown nuance of the industry. Lovell's probably done more of those than anyone else.
Absolutely. Lovell, would you like to speak on it? I think you might be muted.
Yep. Can you hear me now?
There we go. Mm-hmm.
So perfect. A lot of what Moritz talked about was right on. It's about education, and what Blaine's discussing there is going to the regulators and educating them on what the capabilities of esports are, and what are the things like it, and what you need to know about cheating. And what I think is the biggest piece about this is the vernacular that's being used in esports versus traditional betting. So I think about esports and the fact that it's not just one sport. We're talking about 15, 20 different games, really, of them, 4 or 5 of them are core. But we say the word esports, but we're really talking about a large amount of content and categories of games, which really isn't fair. We don't talk about sports in that context. We talk about football, we talk about baseball, we talk about basketball. We don't talk about an entire ecosystem. And thinking an operator can take all of that information at once when they're completely foreign to it, and taking bets on it, and then explaining to their audience of existing customers who have no idea what it is, what's going on. There's a big disconnect that's happening. So as a first step or a foundational step, I would consider education as the number one thing, to Moritz's point, but specifically what it is that you're betting on and why you're betting on that category, and what audience is that going to bring in. And to Steven's point, what does that audience want, and how do I cater to that audience, is the first set of questions that need to be asked.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Lovell, that you bring up. The fragmentation of the space, both like vertically within one game title, you can have so many stakeholders running the show. Especially in the US, they're used to, I have the NFL, I know the exact schedule, I probably know match schedules years ahead. We're not at that point yet with esports, and some of it is due to the structural constraints. Some of it is due to the degree of involvement of the game publisher. But that's exactly it. It's very hard because everybody throws around the latest stack with the big news numbers for esports as a whole. But you need to segment this down. You need to understand what game is relevant in your region, what platform is it played on, and what are the ramifications set by the game publisher, especially around the betting side. At least in this regard, we're looking at a good trend recently, but you're spot on. Being in this industry for a while and having to pitch esports to a lot of stakeholders, especially non-endemics, you have to still jump through all the hoops and catch them up on how this ecosystem that we're all passionate about is actually structured.
Yeah.
Very well said, everyone. Lovell, to your point, how people will pigeonhole esports has been a huge topic of my conversation, certainly. When the differences between Counter-Strike and Dota are as clear as hockey and baseball, right? So there's a huge educational piece to this whole conversation, and Blaine and Steven and Moritz, your points about the thoughtfulness of the consumer, right, and reducing friction on signing up. Many of these people are first-time bettors, so they're completely new to the space. They're younger, and then of course, Blaine, as you said, the revenue isn't there yet, which sort of leads into my next point. I think Lovell would be a wonderful person to speak on this, coming from MGM, and that's with esports being such a considerably smaller handle than traditional sports, what is the value for major retail books to include esports in its offerings?
Yeah, I would say to shift their perspective, at least early on. I know we tend to think about the money grab and the opportunity that exists from a sports betting standpoint of getting to the dollar eventually. But for this particular segment, it needs to be top of the funnel thinking. It needs to be about acquisition. It needs to be about marketing. Specifically, this is a market that isn't being catered to in any way. None of the existing operators, DraftKings, MGM, even Penn, are really moving their sights towards this audience, primarily because there's not enough money in it for their effort. But if you shift the thinking to, I'm doing this particular initiative to gather a new customer, I think it makes it more of a priority. Today, it's a lesser priority, But if I'm saying I'm going to get 10,000 new customers, primarily because I have an esports offering, primarily because I have gaming strategy and initiatives attached to my sports betting program, it makes more sense. From there, I have them in, how do I move them down? And that's a whole nother strategic effort that needs to take place to eventually get to $1. But if your only goal is to make money off this market, it's not ideal. I don't think that you should put your eggs into that basket if your only goal is to grab dollars.
Well, it depends. I mean, in the US, or maybe I would,
and
I would, I would argue
that's a U.S. perspective.
that's a US perspective, of course. I mean, we see other in the more established regulated markets, esports. If you look at some of the numbers, I think Pinnacle has done out. It's their top 4 sport now. We're talking about serious volumes that we see on a global scale and across the network of our customers. Esports has turned from the customer acquisition tool, which was basically the premise of going into esports, let's say 10 to 7 years ago, to now being a real revenue driver. And there's companies like Rivalry, like Steven, who believe in it, who invested early. And I think they will be the first to reap the rewards and ultimately build a customer base that will be relevant enough to sustain a big sportsbook operation from a turnover standpoint. So, I mean, we'll speak about regulatory difficulties maybe later, but if esports is not classified as a sport, if the limits are very low, there's very obvious barriers that we see here for it to blow up on the turnover side too. But I would certainly argue, and Stephen hinted a bit on the audience that is seeing, the potential is absolutely there, and the numbers speak for themselves in other markets. So I think the results initially that we see in the US for esports betting specifically should be taken with a grain of salt. And if you have the vision around it, there are enough examples from regulated territories elsewhere where esports has certainly taken off.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all fantastic points. And Lovell, to yours, I had a conversation with Chris Grove at Eilers recently. We talked about New Jersey and what they're doing over there with A637. We'll certainly get to that a little bit later in the dialogue. But he said even if, you point out, even if we activate 10, 20, 30 new customers, that's still a win, right? That's 30 customers that you can have that
totally
you're
agree.
activating with esports. So I love that perspective.
Yeah.
And just quickly on that, I think Moritz brings up a great point of how big, let's say, esports is for Pinnacle. And I would say the biggest difference between the US and the rest of the global market really comes down to 2 things, which is what are the markets or games or events that you can take book on? And, using Colorado as an example, they probably have the most robust whitelist of available events of any US commercial jurisdiction. And I'm just going to estimate and say it's probably 5 to 10% of the markets that Pinnacle would be offering on a typical day. So from a regulatory perspective, you have much, much smaller markets. And then the biggest thing is in-play betting. Right now, there is no in-play betting in the US. It's one of the reasons we're really excited to be partnered with Grid in the US. I think outside of the US, you would typically see that as 60 to 80% of your handle. So if you're only seeing 5 to 10% of the events that are available, and of those events, you're only seeing 20, 30, 40% of the handle because of the lack of in-play betting, there's no way that you can build a robust market around this or a robust enterprise business. And so that's really the key to unlocking the value of esports betting inside of the US, is working with the regulators to get bigger whitelists of events and games approved, and having the official type of server data that companies like Grid provide so that you can actually offer in-play betting.
Yeah,
excellent.
I totally agree with all of that as well. Just to clear up the perception or the perspective from my angle, operationally, I think that we will be prepared to give the best experience for the consumers, especially with Grid and the services that are being provided by Blaine, by your company. I think before we get to that point, there needs to be relevant connection points for operators, which don't exist today. So what Moritz was talking about was a much more mature audience that understands esports betting and how to get through that funnel. Today's market is at 0, maybe even -5 when you consider where they are from an educational standpoint and a connection to that customer, and then getting that customer prepared to take esports bets. We're not there yet. Even with all of the functions of an operation prepared to go, there's not going to be anything dripping down to get to that level, is where my brain is with it today.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point too, because people don't. I mean, it feels like they forget that sports betting in the U.S. is still so new. PASPA was repealed in 2018. So everyone is still very much figuring this out. And in terms of esports, as well as sports betting at large, it's still going to continue being a collaborative process in terms of figuring it out. Operators are now prioritizing national partnerships with MLB and football and major traditional sports betting products. So appreciate the insight on that from everyone. But narrowing it down again to the U.S. And Stephen, I'd like to toss this one to you, and that's why is this market so important for the esports betting handle, and what are the opportunities here for esports in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my answer is going to sound a lot like everybody else's, which is it's not there yet, but it will be there. I think esports betting handle is not as important, as it in the US as it is for traditional sports betting handle, traditional sports betting operators. Globally, there hasn't been a new regulated market of this size for a long time. So I think it's a massive opportunity, and probably the last of this scope and scale to ever happen again in the traditional sports betting world. There's not another US to kind of regulate. So, I think it's also a little more mature, and they've been battling it out for decades elsewhere, land-based and online sports books. Whereas esports betting, on the other hand, is new globally on a relative basis to traditional sports. So it doesn't need the US in the same way. But that said, the size and relative growth year over year in esports viewership in the US, it's one of the bigger ones. The gambling culture that does exist in the US, it still makes it super attractive. So, I think that, Lovell touched on this. It's also not about just esports betting. It's a pretty good funnel we found to a next generation of bettor who is interested in sports as well, and potentially casino and other products. So the TAM is greater than just the esports GGR. It's the opportunity to leverage the massive growth in a market like the US, average down your user age with an esports bettor, get a better terminal value out of it, and that's significant. So not there today, but it's a great top of funnel to a younger customer for tomorrow. So I think it's still super exciting.
Yeah, that's a really good point to add to that. You mentioned the audience, and esports is growing, the viewership is growing. This is an audience that is kind of expecting instant gratification. This is how the games are structured. The attention span, I would argue, is a lot lower than the one of a sports fan. They're not going to sit around 90 minutes to watch a football game, wait for the results. So Blaine hinted on the abundance of live betting to date, and live betting being the core driver in esports liquidity, as we've seen in other markets. In the US, we go from on the regulated side, at least, like if you think someone can bet a place on a fantasy event, and there's maybe one bet per competition or daily fantasy per game, and there's a lot of effort going into placing that. Going to in a live setting, placing hundreds of bets during one match that are instantly resulted, that are really alluding to this live engagement opportunity. And this is also why we really wanted to bring up the data at the start. The nice thing is this is possible, and it's happening, and we're doing it already. If we look at projections, once from a regulatory perspective, all of that is possible in the States, where we see the biggest audience or where we expect the most liquidity to come from. I would argue that you can be very optimistic about the projections you put out for esports for the time being, because if you have the type of product that allows a high turnover of bets during one game, fast payouts with results coming in instantaneously, this will allow us to, I think, cater to an audience that just enjoys betting. And then we go back to the educational side. It doesn't have to be all esports fans who enjoy esports betting. We see a lot of audience that is coming from traditional sports that might not play anymore, but they watch now, or they engage with esports. We see it because they see that their kids is coming from that in the future, when it comes to the market.
Mm-hmm.
One last piece, Cody, to your question of, the opportunity, if you will, in the US. And I think this is fairly specific to folks like Rivalry and GameCo. The traditional casinos and sports betting operators are not going to address the esports market. They're simply too busy rolling out traditional sports betting and iGaming. And as you have every new state open up over the next 1, 2, 3, even 5 years, they're simply going to be so busy focusing on the legacy business. They're essentially leaving this market open to new innovative companies like Rivalry and GameCo and the partnerships we have with folks that are on the panel here.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole conversation about opportunity in the U.S. and, to Stephen's point, the volume of consumers and the level of viewership that exists here in the States. Blaine, you and I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about how the esports, esports is a $1.1 billion market, right? But esports betting is valued at $17 billion. So, it's like, this is a way to really activate that consumer base, monetize it, and really, support the industry at large. So the benefits are there, especially in the U.S. with the volumes there. Moritz, you talked about the data, and I see we had a question in the chat that's talking about how is this data collected, right? And Blaine, you and I talked a little bit about OCR, online character recognition, scrape data, official data. So Moritz, I was wondering if you could talk to us about how data is collected in esports currently, and maybe the differences between scrape data, official data, and then to sort of loop it back in, how much of an incentivization will this be for operators once data has really reached a point of maximization, right? Because it's the constant conversation, it's the barrier currently, it seems.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The topic data is almost married to betting by now, because it's the fuel to power any successful operation. I think the point you bring up is great, and I always like to speak about the distinction between data that you can scrape and data in esports that you can collect through official partnership and directly integrated means. I think computer vision, optical character recognition, these are great technologies, super interesting. In my opinion, they have a lot more value to add in traditional sports, because they allow to extract data feeds with a higher granularity from a game than manual mesh set entry. In esports, companies focusing on this, in my opinion, they're basically using a crutch instead of really harnessing the potential and the digital nature of the sport. We only work with official data. We recognize esports as an ecosystem, especially when you speak about third-party operators. The sustainability of an esports tournament operation is a big question, and it's tough to pull off. And it's a very wild west market. So emulating the business model around official data assets that exist in traditional sports and using it as a way to supplement the operations and the business operations of tournament organizers and game publishers. This is really at the core of what we do and believe in. If you scrape data from a broadcast for an esports match, you're actually looking at a data source that is delayed by multiple minutes, that has a lot of errors, where data points become static if there's a replay on. So you're ultimately sacrificing all the goodness that you have in esports from a data accuracy and granularity standpoint. And in my opinion, and this is kind of really shared with the types of customers that we have, people who really have a significant turnover handle in esports, this is not usable. If you were serious about esports and you want to power your book by delayed data, which is exposing you to get picked off, which is not allowing you to with confidence offer a lot of markets, which will significantly diminish the market uptime, I think this is hard to succeed. And this is clearly not a model for the long-term future. Before there were any feeds for specific game titles, I think using OCR to have just some kind of data is probably at the start nice. But in order to power a robust betting product and if you really want to engage and have like high limits in your book, it's not going to be sustainable. The data in esports can be gathered from the game client, from the server, being directly integrated with game APIs. And in our model, at least, our belief is to do this via the completely official route. We share all of our revenues with the partners. We provide a lot of transparency. Again, this goes all in the educational agenda I mentioned earlier. This is the right way to harness the potential that is there for esports data because it's digital. And at the end of the day, end-to-end automatic data extraction and processing, this yields the type of results that ultimately enable the fan experience we touched upon earlier, where I just see a massive opportunity for the betting space.
Yeah, absolutely. And the conversation is a little wild, I think, for those that are not well educated on that topic, because you think about esports and API-based games, and the data is so much more diverse than what is available in traditional sports, where it's human-mediated. So the possibilities are there, but I think that it's an interesting conversation of how to get there. So I really appreciate that insight. So we're sort of winding down. I'm going to deviate a little bit from our outline because I do want to talk a little bit more about the U.S. And Blaine, I'll start with you, and Stephen, Lovell, Moritz, if anyone else wants to chime in on this question, feel free. But I was wondering if you could, Blaine, talk to us a little bit about the significance of New Jersey passing the bill A637, which was sort of unofficially known as the Esports Betting Bill, through the lower house last month. So now it's headed to Senate for final approval. But I was wondering what sort of developments you expect to see as a result of this bill if it is to be passed by Senate.
The esports betting bill, that's what we.
I know we need that in every state, right, Moritz?
Absolutely.
It's a really important piece of legislation. So just to start with, esports betting is currently legal in New Jersey. And I think that's a big misunderstanding that I certainly run into all the time. There are essentially three issues with the current legislation in New Jersey that will be fixed with the bill that's making its way through the legislature there. So the first is, because of a drafting error, you can't take book on a match or an event in which players are 17 or younger. And my understanding is that's going to be fixed in this bill. The second, and Moritz touched on this earlier, is that there currently, without a special exemption, is a $100 max bet and a $500 max win. Now, granted, the average bet in esports is about $25, but still, you want to be able to bring in big bettors and be able to take book on it to build up a really nice handle. But the last piece is the most important, and Lovell's dealt with this quite a bit. Currently in New Jersey, they use the other event model, which is also used in Nevada. And that means that you have to make a submission to the Division of Gaming Enforcement in New Jersey. It has to outline all of the parameters of the event, the date, time, game, the wagers you want to take, who's competing, how you're managing integrity. And what's pretty amazing about it, currently in New Jersey, it has to first go through the DGE and then make its way all the way up to the governor himself, who has to approve that event for wagering in the state. That is, first of all, very inefficient. But second of all, I, as an operator, I don't want to take the governor's time to approve an esports event for wagering. He must have more important things to do. And so that's the biggest thing that this bill is going to fix, is it's going to allow markets to be able to be conducted on a much more normalized basis, just like you have for every other type of traditional sport. It's very normal to have this in traditional sports, and that's what this bill is going to solve in New Jersey for esports.
Yeah, very well said, guys.
To add on to that, I'll be quick, Cody. Just to add on to that, from the stakeholders' perspective, that should make me excited. If I'm a league, if I'm a publisher, I should look at that as an indicator or a signal that esports betting could potentially be a revenue stream for me, or at least a way for me to interact with an operator that didn't exist before. how do I get my league or my content okayed by New Jersey so it could be easily bet on. Things like that are something from the stakeholders' perspective, especially if you're an organization, having that as a consideration for driving revenue is something that I would consider.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to make betting on esports in New Jersey just easier, right? There's the limits, as you said, Blaine, where it's $100 bet, $500 max bet, but it's going to, offer operators the ability to start, offering wagers on esports, which should be enough for them to gauge the market, test things out, and see what they do and don't like about it. Look, this conversation has been wonderful. We didn't get probably through half of the questions I've written down for all of us to talk about, but we have a bunch of questions in the chat. So I thought that we could go ahead and talk about some of these really fast. We got about 5 minutes. So one that's come in, Stephen, I think this is probably would be best for you, and maybe Lovell, if you want to speak on this, is can traditional sports betting companies like Bet365, William Hill, etc., compete effectively with their esports offering against dedicated esports books? What are the pros and cons?
Yeah, I mean, I think from our perspective, anybody can, sign up to BetGenius Sport Radar, get the same odds and data feed, and offer the product. I mean, we don't think that we're differentiating on that side at all. I think the biggest thing that a dedicated esports offering has is what I touched on at the beginning, is just actually getting someone from top of funnel to convert at the bottom. It's significantly more than the offering. I mean, we've been doing this for a few years now, and I'd say like the offering is probably, a tier 3 consideration when it comes to actually converting someone and getting them to bet, especially if it's a first-time bettor. So experientially, like you need a modern user experience for a generation or a bettor that on average is 15 to 20 years younger than a traditional sports bettor in many cases. So everything about it has to be different. I mean, like we will quite literally go into the community of markets we're in and get customer support staff from that community, so the user feels like they're talking to someone that they know. So it's like everything down to that level. And then the other thing is, I think there's definitely an education component. A lot of them are stepping in for the first time, so it's offering like a little bit more support. The kind of hand-holding you have to provide to this bettor is significantly higher still at this stage in a traditional sports bettor. I'm not sure they would get that experience from a Bet365. And there's also just no ROI in it for Bet365. They have no reason to take somebody depositing $50 and betting $10 and allocating their resources to it. So I just don't think they're going to get it there yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
The only thing I would add to that is the illegal market is probably something that we should have talked more about than we have to this point. They, at least in the US, have a stranglehold on the esports market, and they've been doing it for a while now. So and the most important part about that is the people that bet on esports don't know that it's illegal to bet with them, nor do they care. As long as they get their money in and out and the transactions are happening on a frequent basis, then they're okay. So getting it from them, if I'm a traditional operator, is a little bit more concerning than anything, because they've already made that connection. They've already got the points of marketing, and they've already got them doing transactions on a regular basis. Getting them to operate or at least have transactions with me seems to be a little bit more of an issue than doing it with a person who's only focused on, or a company that's only focused on esports betting.
Just one last thing to pick up on what Stephen said is none of the traditional sports books or casinos are going to have the time, bandwidth, expertise, or ability to activate on esports betting in the way that dedicated books like Rivalry or GameCo are. They're just so busy rolling out traditional sports and esports. I'm sorry, traditional sports betting and iGaming. And as each new state comes on board, that's just going to continue and continue. So it leaves this massive gap in the market for innovative startups to jump in and really dominate esports, which is going to be, a very, very significant business over the next 2, 3, 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think together, and certainly Stephen has underlined this as well as everyone else, is this market is just so, obviously it's new, but it's, new relative to 20 years, however long you want to say, but it's just such a unique market in terms of the consumer, the sport itself. What is the appropriate way to market, to collect data? Everything about this is so new. So really having to dig in and understand. And Blaine, to your point, and Lovell as well, operators don't have the resources, the time, the energy, or the incentive really yet to devote to esports and understanding. So I think we might have time for one more quick question. This can be open to whomever, and I think we've answered this in a few ways as well. But in what ways specifically can esports betting support the esports industry at large? Now, Blaine, we obviously talked about monetization, but if anyone else has an opinion they'd like to throw out, be happy to hear it.
Well, just one thing on what you brought up earlier, Cody. Everyone talks about esports being a $1.1 billion industry, which you touched on, but it's actually only $175 million in consumer spending. All the rest of that is corporate spending. But with $17 billion in handle on the esports betting industry, it's just a much, much bigger market in terms of consumer spending. And I think that the next piece of it, and this is where Rivalry is really the market leader, is engaging fans. I often bring outsiders to esports events, and a lot of these games, particularly the most popular ones like Dota and League, are pretty impenetrable to a first-time viewer. But companies like Rivalry have just done an amazing job with media and communication and content to engage wider fan bases. And that's really what we need as an industry to grow.
Yeah, to add to that, we work with esports stakeholders predominantly. We work with leagues, we work with teams, and betting has proven to be an amazing engagement driver for sport. And you mentioned the revenue numbers, Blaine. It's true. Like if you look at the consumer spending side, esports is just a very small part. All the consumer spending is happening in gaming. And esports spending at the moment is mainly broadcast licenses and sponsorships, so the B2B spending that you mentioned. Esports betting has proven to be a really relevant revenue channel for a lot of competitions. But I think also on the engagement side, esports is catering to both the most engaged fans who really know their games by heart, who play 6 hours a day. This is a great way to even form a deeper connection to the sport that you love and watch. But betting also always has while you watch, an educational component. If you see odds on an event, it allows you to gauge a lot better what's going on. It in a way, it contextualizes the action as it is unfolding. So through introducing betting to esport, it's also underlining the accessibility factor. So I'm confident esports betting has been successful in bringing a broader audience to different game titles. And this educational aspect there is important. And the game publishers and tournament organizers, they are aiming for more accessibility. This is what they care about for their game titles, to grow their audience. And I think betting is playing a critical part in this conversation. And this is what we hear from the more than 50 tournament organizers or game publishers we are partnered with, who are now, especially in a post-PASPA repeal world, we've seen a trend where, especially on game publisher side, there's more engagement around it. So we can see, to answer the question directly, the sustainability of the ecosystem is aided by esports betting, and generally in creating more engagement, more buzz around it, and introducing more people to the sport. This is the role that esports betting has for the industry, in my opinion.
Yeah, excellently said, Moritz. And a great way to finish this certainly all-star panel we've assembled here today. So I certainly wish we had more time, because there's, again, still so much to talk about, but I think you nailed it on the head in terms of monetization, engagement, activating this audiences, and overall the sustainability of it, right? Really perfect way to encapsulate it. I'd like to thank all of you guys for joining me today. It's been a wonderful chat and conversation, as well as everyone at home that's viewing and listening and submitting questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but I'm sure you can go ahead and research, follow any of these guys on social media, or visit whatever you got to do. So with that being said, thank you guys for joining.